There was nothing remarkable about the subway at midnight. Dim lights, hollow echoes, and the quiet hum of the city's underbelly. For Mia, it was just another late-night commute after a grueling shift. She settled into her seat, exhausted, just wanting to zone out until she got home. Only a handful of passengers were scattered across the train car, each buried in their phones or staring vacantly out the windows. But Mia wasn't alone. She noticed a man at the far end of the car, slouched against the wall, his head tilted in her direction. She tried to shake off the strange feeling he gave her. People watched each other on the subway all the time. But something about this man felt off. His face was pale, almost gaunt, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes were wide, unblinking, like he was studying her every move. She shifted uncomfortably, glancing out the window to avoid his gaze, only to see his reflection. He was still staring. She thought about moving to another car, but then the train abruptly jerked and slowed to a stop. They were in the middle of a tunnel and the silence was suffocating. The lights flickered. Once, twice, and then they went out, plunging the car into pitch-black darkness. Mia's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for the emergency lights to kick in. When they finally did, they cast a dim red glow across the car, making the shadows deeper, the air heavier. She dared to look toward the man, only to find he was gone. Her breath hitched. Maybe he had slipped out during the blackout, she told herself. But she hadn't heard the door slide open. The silence was too thick, too heavy, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. Mia, a voice cut through the quiet, low, guttural, like it had come from right beside her. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't told anyone her name, hadn't spoken a word since she boarded the train. She whipped her head around, and there he was, closer than before, just a few seats away. His face was illuminated by the faint red glow, his eyes sunken, lips curled in an unnatural smile. "How do you know my name?" she stammered, gripping her seat. But he didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head, his expression twisted with something between amusement and malice. "I've always known, Mia," he whispered, his voice barely a rasp. "I've been watching you, every night." She felt a chill crawl down her spine. Every night? This was her usual route, but she'd never noticed him before. At least she didn't think so. The details of her routine were a blur, a monotonous haze of subway rides and crowded platforms. But now, his face seemed familiar. A face she'd seen in fleeting glances, half hidden in shadows, always at the far end of the car. "You can't ignore me forever, Mia," he said, his voice taking on a strange echo, as if it were coming from every direction at once. The lights flickered again, and for a split second she saw other figures in the car. Shadows, outlines of people, all staring at her with those same hollow eyes. When the lights stabilized, they were gone, and it was just her and the man, locked in this silent, chilling confrontation. Her phone was in her pocket, but when she tried to unlock it, the screen glitched, static filling her vision as if some unseen force was jamming her signal. She was trapped. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, barely able to keep the fear from her voice. The man's smile widened, revealing teeth too white, too sharp. "Because no one remembers me, Mia. No one cares to look, not anymore. I needed someone to see me, to remember." He leaned closer, and she felt a chill, like ice brushing her skin. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm the one who never made it home. Years ago, I was waiting for this train, but something went wrong. I got left behind. Now I wander these tunnels, night after night, waiting for someone like you." Mia felt bile rise in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body was frozen in place, her limbs heavy and numb. The lights flickered once more, and when they steadied, the man was gone. Mia was alone in the car, her heart pounding as she stared at the empty seat where he'd just been. As the train finally lurched back into motion, she stumbled to her feet, rushing to the nearest door. She couldn't breathe until she was off that train, away from whatever nightmare she had just endured. When the doors opened at the next station, she practically fell onto the platform, gasping for air. She glanced back into the subway car, her eyes scanning the rows of seats. The man was nowhere to be seen. But as the train pulled away, her gaze fell on the glass window. There, scrawled in the fogged-up glass, was a single word, as if written by an unseen hand. "Remember." The subway platform was silent, the distant hum of the departing train fading into the night. She knew she'd never forget that face, those eyes, and that chilling word she would always remember. But she wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a curse. I work the night shift as a subway conductor in New York City. People say the graveyard shift is the worst, but I kind of liked it. Fewer passengers, less noise. It was just me, the rails, and the quiet hum of the train in the dead of night. That is, until the night I drove the phantom carriage. It started like any other shift. The clock hit 2 a.m., and I was assigned to take a last train through one of the older lines that was due for maintenance. This train was supposed to be out of service. The lights inside flickered, the seats were worn, and a slight musty smell hung in the air. But the tracks needed clearing for the maintenance crew in the morning, so I set off, planning for an uneventful ride. But when I looked in my rearview mirror, my heart skipped a beat. A man was sitting in the last car. That shouldn't have been possible. No one should have been on board. I took a deep breath and spoke into the intercom, trying to keep my voice steady. "This train is out of service. You need to disembark at the next stop." No response. The man just sat there, head lowered, obscured by a shadow. I told myself he was probably a homeless guy or someone who had passed out drunk. But as the train hurtled into the darkness, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There was something off about him. The lights cast an odd glow on his pale, almost translucent skin. He sat perfectly still, his head tilted down with an eerie calm that made me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't quite alive. We entered a tunnel, and the lights began to flicker. When I looked back in the mirror, he was gone. My heart pounded, my hands sweaty against the controls. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself he'd moved or somehow slipped into another car. Then, in my peripheral vision, I saw him again. 2 cars closer now. My throat went dry. The train was still in motion. No doors had opened, no footsteps echoed through the car. But there he was, moving closer, his head still lowered, his features still hidden. I was alone on this train. There was no one I could call for help. Every instinct in my body told me to stop, but something compelled me to keep going. The train felt like it had a life of its own, pushing forward with a force I couldn't control. And as we entered the next station, he appeared again. 2 rows away from the control cabin, he lifted his head. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets staring straight through me, like windows to a darkness I couldn't comprehend. A sickly, twisted grin stretched across his pale face, his lips cracked and colorless. He began to speak, his voice barely a whisper, echoing through the empty car. "I was just trying to go home," he rasped, each word heavy with an unimaginable sadness. I gripped the controls, frozen as he continued. But they left me, forgot me. There was nothing remarkable about the subway at midnight. Dim lights, hollow echoes, and the quiet hum of the city's underbelly. For Mia, it was just another late-night commute after a grueling shift. She settled into her seat, exhausted, just wanting to zone out until she got home. Only a handful of passengers were scattered across the train car, each buried in their phones or staring vacantly out the windows. But Mia wasn't alone. She noticed a man at the far end of the car, slouched against the wall, his head tilted in her direction. She tried to shake off the strange feeling he gave her. People watched each other on the subway all the time. But something about this man felt off. His face was pale, almost gaunt, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes were wide, unblinking, like he was studying her every move. She shifted uncomfortably, glancing out the window to avoid his gaze, only to see his reflection. He was still staring. She thought about moving to another car, but then the train abruptly jerked and slowed to a stop. They were in the middle of a tunnel, and the silence was suffocating. The lights flickered. Once, twice, and then they went out, plunging the car into pitch-black darkness. Mia's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for the emergency lights to kick in. When they finally did, they cast a dim red glow across the car, making the shadows deeper, the air heavier. She dared to look toward the man, only to find he was gone. Her breath hitched. Maybe he had slipped out during the blackout, she told herself. But she hadn't heard the door slide open. The silence was too thick, too heavy, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. "Mia?" A voice cut through the quiet, low, guttural, like it had come from right beside her. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't told anyone her name, hadn't spoken a word since she boarded the train. She whipped her head around, and there he was, closer than before, just a few seats away. His face was illuminated by the faint red glow, his eyes sunken, lips curled in an unnatural smile. "How do you know my name?" she stammered, gripping her seat. But he didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head, his expression twisted with something between amusement and malice. "I've always known, Mia," he whispered, his voice barely a rasp. "I've been watching you, every night." She felt a chill crawl down her spine. Every night? This was her usual route, but she'd never noticed him before. At least she didn't think so. The details of her routine were a blur, a monotonous haze of subway rides and crowded platforms. But now, his face seemed familiar. A face she'd seen in fleeting glances, half hidden in shadows, always at the far end of the car. "You can't ignore me forever, Mia," he said, his voice taking on a strange echo, as if it were coming from every direction at once. Marcus was a creature of habit. Every night, he took the same subway route home after work. It was usually quiet, save for the dull hum of the rails and the occasional clank of metal echoing through the empty cars. But tonight, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, thicker, almost as if it carried a charge. He settled into his usual seat near the window, pulling out his phone to distract himself. But he felt watched. The train car was empty, yet he couldn't shake the eerie sensation. Ignoring it, he focused on his screen, trying to lose himself in anything that might take his mind off the creeping unease. That's when he heard it. A whisper. Faint, barely audible, as if coming from behind him. Marcus froze, his eyes flicking to the reflection in the window. There was no one there. Just him, his own silhouette, and the rows of empty seats. But the whisper persisted. It sounded like voices. Several of them, blending together in a strange, disturbing harmony. "Help me. Don't look. Stay here." Each word was softer than the last, but each one sent a chill racing down his spine. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, a trick of the mind, an echo bouncing off the empty seats. But deep down, he knew that wasn't it. There was something alive in those whispers, something pleading and desperate. He tried to shake it off, but the whispers grew louder, filling the car with their haunting, disembodied pleas. "Please, don't look back. Keep your eyes forward. Don't turn around." The urge to turn was overwhelming, but something about the warnings sent a wave of terror coursing through him. They didn't want him to look. Or maybe it was better if he didn't. He gripped the edge of his seat, willing himself to stay still, staring straight ahead. But then, a sudden cold breeze swept through the car, chilling him to the bone. Slowly, despite every instinct telling him not to, Marcus turned. There, just a few feet away, was a woman. Her face was pale and gaunt, with eyes wide open, frozen in an expression of utter terror. Her clothes were worn and tattered, and there were dark smudges around her eyes, as if she hadn't slept in days. She sat stiffly, hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring directly at him. Their eyes met, and in that moment, he felt her pain, her desperation. She tried to speak, but all that came out was a hoarse, strangled whisper. "They don't let us leave." His heart pounded. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body felt rooted in place, paralyzed by fear. More figures began to appear, filling the seats around him. Men, women, children, all with that same look of despair etched on their faces. They stared at him, pleading silently, their mouths moving, but no sound escaping. And then they began to speak in unison. "Don't turn around." The voices grew louder, a symphony of despair echoing through the car, until it felt like it was pressing in on him from every direction. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All he could do was sit there, trapped in his seat, as the voices continued to whisper. "Stay with us. Don't leave." He shut his eyes, covering his ears, but the voices seeped through, relentless and unyielding. When he finally dared to open his eyes, the figures were gone. The car was empty once more, the silence pressing in like a shroud. He let out a shaky breath, wiping the sweat from his forehead. The train screeched to a halt, and the doors slid open at his stop. He staggered to his feet, practically throwing himself out of the car, gasping for air. But as he stepped onto the platform, he heard it. One final whisper, trailing after him like a lingering ghost. "See you tomorrow." He turned, glancing back at the empty train. There, written in the condensation on the window, was a single word. Stay. He knew he'd never take that train again. But deep down, he also knew it didn't matter. Because somehow, no matter what he did, the voices would always find him. It was well past midnight when Jackson stumbled onto the last train, bleary-eyed and tired after a long shift. He'd missed his usual route home, and this train was his only option. He didn't recognize the line, but he was too tired to care. It was empty, except for him, and the silence was comforting. He settled into a seat, letting the soft hum of the engine lull him. The train rattled through the darkness, and Jackson closed his eyes. But after what felt like too long, he opened them again and looked around. The train hadn't stopped for several minutes, longer than it should have. The lights flickered, bathing the car in a dim, eerie glow. He glanced around, suddenly aware of how still everything was. He leaned forward to check his surroundings through the window. Only blackness greeted him on the other side. No passing stations, no hint of city lights, just endless dark. A sense of dread seeped into him, settling in his stomach like ice. He pulled out his phone to check the time, but saw there was no signal, not even the faintest bar. He tried not to panic, rationalizing that he'd just missed his stop, and that soon enough, he'd reach the next station. But the train kept moving deeper and deeper into the tunnel. Then the train began to slow, eventually grinding to a halt in front of a station, one he'd never seen before. The platform was dimly lit with cracked tiles and signs covered in dust and grime. The letters on the sign above the platform were faded, almost unreadable. Squinting, Jackson could barely make out the name, Borough Street. He'd lived in the city his entire life, but he'd never heard of this station. Hesitantly, he got to his feet, clutching his bag, and stepped off the train. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. Every instinct screamed for him to get back on the train, but the doors slid shut behind him, and the train departed, leaving him alone on the abandoned platform. He waited, expecting another train to arrive, but the platform remained eerily quiet. Jackson pulled out his phone again, only to find it still showed no signal. Frustration and unease simmered in his chest as he looked around for any sign of life, but there was none. The platform was empty. As he paced back and forth, he noticed something odd scratched into the walls, faint etchings almost invisible in the dim light. He leaned closer, squinting to read the words, "Don't look back." Chills prickled his skin. He turned to look down the empty hallway leading away from the platform. He wasn't sure why, but he felt a strong urge to follow it. The silence around him grew even thicker as he ventured down the hall, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The hallway twisted and turned, leading deeper underground, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the stale air. After a few minutes of walking, he found another scratched message on the wall. "They're watching you." His heart thundered in his chest. He turned around, ready to bolt back down the hallway, only to find the path he'd come from, gone. In its place was a solid concrete wall. Panic gripped him as he pounded his fists against it, shouting, but his voice only echoed back at him, swallowed by the cold, unfeeling darkness. A faint hum filled the air, and to his horror, another train was pulling into the platform. This train looked ancient, its windows caked with grime, its metal exterior rusted and warped. The doors slid open, revealing a nearly pitch-black interior, but Jackson caught a glimpse of shadows, faces staring back at him, their eyes hollow and blank. He took a step back, but his feet felt rooted to the spot, as though some invisible force was holding him in place. One of the figures inside the train leaned forward, her face pressed against the window, her expression twisted in terror. "Please," she mouthed, her voice faint, almost inaudible. "Don't make the same mistake." The lights on the platform began to flicker, and Jackson felt a cold breeze brush past him, whispering through the empty space. "Stay, stay, stay." The figures in the train continued to stare at him, their faces a mixture of despair and resignation, as if they'd been trapped there for years, decades maybe. The train doors slid shut, and it began to pull away, leaving him in silence once more. A deep, hollow voice echoed through the station, sending a chill down his spine. "Welcome to Borough Street, Jackson. The last stop." He turned and found himself back on the first platform, his heart pounding as he stared at the scratched messages, the crumbling walls, the eerie silence. And there, in the dim light, he saw new words etched into the wall, right where he had first stepped off the train. There's no way out. The oppressive silence swallowed him whole, pressing down on him like a weight he could never escape. He was trapped, lost in a place that had long been forgotten, in a station that didn't exist. He'd become just another ghost wandering Borough Street, waiting for someone else to take his place. Emma had heard rumors about the Midnight Line, an urban legend whispered among subway workers and late-night commuters. According to the stories, a ghost train appeared after 2 a.m. on rare occasions. It looked like a regular subway car, but operated on a schedule and route that didn't exist on any map. The few people who'd supposedly boarded it were never seen again. She dismissed it as nonsense until the night she worked late and missed her usual train home. Desperate and exhausted, Emma found herself standing alone on the platform, waiting for the next train. The clock read 2:07 a.m. She sighed and checked her phone, which had only 3% battery left. Then, out of nowhere, she heard the familiar rumble of an approaching train. Relief washed over her, until she realized the station was entirely empty. No announcements, no indication of any incoming train. The train rolled into the station, looking like any other subway car, except for the number on its display, 0000. Emma hesitated, the ghost stories flashing through her mind, but exhaustion won out. She stepped onto the empty car, the doors closing behind her with a hiss. She chose a seat in the middle, hoping to close her eyes for the short ride home. As the train started moving, she felt an uncomfortable silence settle around her. There was no hum of the usual mechanics, no flickering lights or ambient city sounds. Instead, the only noise was a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the far end of the car. She turned, squinting through the dim light, and froze. At the end of the car sat a man in a faded suit, staring at her. His eyes were blank, lifeless, and he wore a strange expression, somewhere between a smile and a grimace. He continued tapping his fingers against the metal pole beside him, each tap echoing ominously. Emma tried to brush it off, telling herself he was just an eccentric night traveler. But as she looked around, she noticed more passengers appearing, one by one, as if emerging from the shadows. Their faces were unnaturally pale, with eyes that seemed to stare straight through her. None of them moved, they simply sat there, watching her with expressions of eerie calm. Unnerved, Emma averted her gaze and checked her phone. It was dead. She cursed under her breath, gripping the edge of her seat. Every instinct screamed for her to get off at the next station, no matter where it was. But the train wasn't stopping. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the train plowed deeper into the darkness. The passengers remained silent, staring, their vacant expressions growing more unsettling with each passing second. Finally, unable to bear the tension, Emma stood and moved toward the nearest door, hoping to see some sign of the outside. But all she saw was endless blackness outside the window, as if the train were moving through an abyss. Then, as she looked closer, she noticed faint impressions in the dark. Faces. Hundreds of faces pressed against the windows, mouths open in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. She stumbled back, her heart pounding. The faces seemed to move with the train, watching her, pleading with her. A soft voice broke the silence, whispering from the seat beside her. She turned to see an elderly woman, her face hollow and sunken, her lips cracked and dry. "They're the lost ones," the woman murmured, her gaze fixed on Emma. "They boarded the Midnight Line, just like you." Emma backed away, trembling. "What is this? Where are we going?" The woman's eyes gleamed with a sadness that seemed ancient. "To the end of the line." Emma felt a surge of panic. "I need to get off. Let me off this train." The woman shook her head slowly. "There is no getting off, not once you've boarded." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "We're all bound here, forever." Emma looked around desperately, searching for any way out, but the windows showed only darkness. The doors sealed tight. The other passengers began to chant softly, their voices blending into a chilling, rhythmic hum. "Stay with us. Forever." A deep rumbling filled the train and the lights flickered. Emma's heart raced as she tried to pry the doors open, her nails scraping against the metal, but it was useless. The train was moving faster now, hurtling through the dark at an impossible speed. The chanting grew louder, filling her ears, drowning out her thoughts. She closed her eyes, squeezing them shut as she felt the walls around her close in, the air turning thick and stale. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. When Emma opened her eyes, the train had stopped. She was alone in the car, the eerie passengers gone, and the doors slid open. Dazed, she stumbled out onto the platform, her heart still racing. She looked around, expecting to see her usual station, but what she saw made her blood run cold. The platform was deserted, cracked and overgrown, as if it hadn't been used in decades. The sign above was faded and almost unreadable, but she could just make out the name, Midnight Terminal. The train behind her disappeared into the darkness, leaving her stranded on the forgotten platform. She tried her phone again, but it was still dead. She looked around, hoping for some sign of where she was, but all she saw were faded posters and broken tiles. There was no exit in sight, only endless tunnels stretching in every direction. As she took a step forward, her heart pounding with dread, she heard a familiar sound, the rumble of an approaching train. But this time, the platform was empty. And in the distance, the echoing whisper of voices drifted through the tunnel. Welcome to the Midnight Line, forever.